Good morning, and we will go ahead and call our meeting to order, the MAPS 4 Citizens Advisory Board meeting for October 7th, 2021. Our first item of business is the approval of minutes of our September 2nd meeting. Does anybody have any discussion? If not, I'll take a motion in a second for approval. Okay, please cast your vote.
I'll have to go verbal if mine's not showing up. I'm sorry. I'll have to go verbal. For some reason, I don't have a vote. She may, well, maybe not. Sorry.
Perfect.
We're good.
Okay, the motion passed. Thank you. Sometimes, Kevin, we need a little assistance.
I'm challenged half the time.
So our next item is to receive the revenue and expenditure report. So, David?
Thank you, Madam Chair. You have in your packet the revenue and expenditures report for the period ending August 31st, 2021 in its usual form. As a summary, on the revenue side, for the month, $11,238,296, and total revenue $148,167,913. And then on the expenditure side for the month, $29,000, and total of $1,059,000. And I'll try to answer any questions if you have any.
Any questions? It looks like month over month, we're kind of ooching in and recovering that revenue that we lost. So
we are, that's a good point.
Slowly but surely.
Yeah, we're down to 2% now, and we were the first of the year about over 7.
Right, great. Okay, take a motion in a second. Okay. Please cast your votes. Okay, the report is received. Thank you. Okay, moving on to items under item number 4, discussion items. Today we thought we would, since there are some members of the board who have not been really involved with some of the other MAPS processes or any of the subcommittees, we thought that it might be helpful to take a minute and go through those steps, go through so that we understand what all of those components are. So Jason Cotton is going to make a presentation to us today about that process moving forward. Hello.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Board members, it's good to see everyone this morning. Thank you for giving us the time to come to present to you this morning. So it was occurring to me this morning when I got up that this meeting was probably going to feel a little bit like the morning after, right? So obviously September was a really exciting month, I think, for the MAPS 4 program. You know, the board meeting last month was very positive, obviously getting the implementation plan approved unanimously, and was a great milestone, and felt great to get through that. You know, I have this feeling today that it's time for us to sit down and get to work, and so I think the presentation that we have this morning, I think, is very consistent with that sentiment. As Teresa mentioned, we have a presentation this morning really about process. And so really what we're trying to do, you know, we spent several months talking about the MAPS 4 program. I think, although it probably felt like we were in the weeds a little bit, really kind of discussing it at a high level. And so really what we want to try to do today a little bit is spend some time and dig into some of the details on what these projects will look like from a pragmatic perspective if you're sitting on the board or the subcommittee, or if perhaps you're a resident that's following the program. And so we're going to spend some time on a few things this morning and hopefully provide some clarity in terms of what the next several months will look like. So as I said, September was a great month. Unless you were on an extended vacation and had no cell service, you obviously know that the implementation plan was passed at City Council on the 14th unanimously, and so felt great to get there. You know, it's interesting, ADG gave a presentation at an AIA luncheon recently, and we spent some time comparing the MAPS 4 program to the MAPS 3 program. And it's interesting to note that from the day that the program was approved by the voters to the day that we had an implementation plan approved was essentially the same. It's about 20 months, 20, 21 months. And so, you know, it's interesting to think back to everything that's occurred in the world since December of 19 when we voted on MAPS 4. The fact that we were able to get all of that accomplished in the same amount of time, I think, is a real testament to not only the MAPS office, but, you know, I think our team back at the office and the board as well. So, you know, really just a pat on the back to everybody for continuing to march through that process, because I know we had a lot of roadblocks in our way. So since the September meetings, once we got to council approval, there have been some things moving forward. Some of you may have already gotten wind that there are some requests for qualifications that are out on the street today, and so we've listed those here for you specifically. There's about 4 of them that are out right now. There may be more actually as of today, but we have the RFQ for the downtown arena, the Cameron and South Lakes Park improvements, also the bus stop, the first phase of bus stop improvements, and the first phase of beautification. And so all of those are out on the street right now. I think this indicates October 4th for the arena, so I think those qualification statements may have already been received and are in the process of being reviewed. And so we are certainly, as I said, getting to work and moving on down the road in terms of program execution. And so that's exciting to see.
Jason?
Yes,
Could you
ma'am.
explain the difference in, so I'm familiar with an RFQ, but what's a letter of interest? Is that the first step?
Yeah, that's just what it's referred to when the city releases a request for qualifications. The city formally requests a letter of interest from interested parties, and so that's the phrase we use for their response back to the city.
Okay.
So, there are some things in addition to those things which I've already mentioned. There are some things that are in process. We're deep in the thralls of developing requests for proposals from operators for several facilities, and so. We talked about this a lot, I think, during development of the program, that at the first year or so of this program was going to be really operator heavy. And so, you know, we have a lot of agreements that we are going to be wading through over the next several months. And so ADG and the MAPS office are really busy right now developing these RFPs. And so there will be a big group of them that will come your way in pretty short order. And so I would just tell you this is essentially the calm before the storm here this month. We have also, I think, in the last few weeks, I've characterized it for my team as I feel like this program is really between 2 seasons. Like we spent the first several months with almost like this laser-like focus on getting the implementation plan developed, the program schedule developed, and the implementation plan approved. But now that's done, and we've moved on to actual execution of the program. And so there's a lot of things, I think, you know, both for David's office and our staff in terms of trying to get ready for that. It's just the project has a little bit different feel than it did even a month ago. And so we're spending a lot of time getting organized, getting staffing plans in place, and just really doing administrative work and trying to get prepared for all of this work that we're about to embark on. And so that's taken, I think, some time over the last 3 or 4 weeks. So all that being said, the stuff that's in process, the stuff that's already been accomplished, you might be asking yourself what's next. And so that's really what the presentation this morning is about. And so I think to really try to characterize this, we wanted to spend some time on really 4 phases of work in particular. And so you might remember from our previous presentations, we talked about construction phases being the building, or these phases of project phases being really the building blocks of this program. And I think if you were to go back and look at the implementation plan, there's probably 9 or 10 different categories of project phases that we identified. They're represented by different colors, but there's 4 of these that you are, as a board, are going to see over and over and over again, and it's the 4 that we've identified here. And so they're really kind of what I consider the bread and butter of these projects. And so we felt like it made some sense to maybe spend some time and really dig into these a little bit and really try to provide some clarity in terms of what the board will see, what the subcommittees will see as we're going through each one of these phases. So really just going to start off with operator selection and agreement. And so that process, operator selection agreement, we would really characterize it really into 3 groups of activities. And so there's this first group, which is the advertisement. And so that's really just the city issuing a public notice of this intent to engage with an operator, requesting a letter of interest from those that are interested. So once that's accomplished, yes, ma'am.
Can you talk a little bit more about the advertisement part so how is that kind of like done? Like what outlets does the city use, or Can you just, yeah.
Yeah, so I'm going to go over the top of this, and then we'll dig down into each one of these a little bit more. So hopefully I'll answer your question. But so yeah, once we get through advertisement, we go on to selection, and so that's really just the formal process that the city goes through. There'll be a group of operators that will respond to the advertisement. The city will then basically take that group and go through a selection process to select a single operator. And so there's a group of activities associated with that. And then once an operator is selected, there's obviously some time spent in actually developing the agreement. And so as you might expect from that description, that can take some time to get through that process. There are several places, though, where formal action by the subcommittee, the Citizens Advisory Board, City Council will be required. And so we're going to spend some time on each one of these this morning, but I think it's helpful to just see an overview of what this process looks like and when staff will be coming to you to check in with a particular item that they need the board to weigh in on. And so, you know, I think I kind of think of these as checkpoints along the way. As I said, you know, we'll be going through this for several months, and so there'll be times when we stop, we call a timeout, we bring you something and let you weigh in on it and make sure that we're staying between the ditches, so to speak. So really just starting off with the advertisement, to address Daisy's question, you know, really the first step in the advertisement process is really just development of a request for proposal. And so there'll be basically a document that is prepared. It will have some general requirements. It'll have a description of the selection process. It will have really just a general description of the facility that we are seeking an operator for, like what we anticipate the scope of that facility might be, what the program of that facility might be. And so we'll just try to explain it in general terms for any operators that might be interested. There are also, in this request for proposal, there's also a very long list of submittal requirements, and so you can see a list of those here. So these are things that the city would request from potential operators. But really, you know, not to go through each and every one of the items on this slide, really the way that I would characterize it is the city just wants to get a feel for what type of experience and qualifications a potential operator has, and then also what their business plan is for this facility that the RFP is related to. And so that's really, in essence, what we're trying to, I guess, gather from potential operators as a part of this initial phase. And so one of the things that we'll also include in addition to that is really proposal evaluation criteria. And so we, as you can see from this slide, we have this big laundry list of things that we ask from them. At the end of the RFP, there'll be a list that will identify of these items that we've requested, how important one item might be relative to another. And so usually it takes the form of a weighting criteria. So it may say that qualifications and background is 20% of how the proposal will be scored, financial capacity might be 10%, and so on and so forth. And so it just really, the intent is to give potential respondents an idea of what things the city considers more or less valuable. And so that will be included in the RFP. So once the RFP is prepared, for the operators in particular, that RFP, once ADG's worked on it, the MAPS office has really got it in a final form where we feel like it's ready to release publicly. That RFP will come back to the subcommittee, the Citizens Advisory Board, and the council. Now, I think it's important to remember that the process that we go through, we typically provide something to subcommittee. The subcommittee considers it. They make a recommendation to the Citizens Advisory Board, and then the Citizens Advisory Board takes that consideration, reviews it for themselves, and makes a recommendation to council. So council carries the final authorization, really. So, you know, we've tried to, I guess, clarify that here, and I think it's pretty clear if you were to review the implementation plan, but there'll be several places this morning where I have some text highlighted in blue. And what I'm trying to avoid is having to write all of this out every single time. And so just know that whenever we mention something being considered, that's the process that we're implying, that recommendation from the subcommittee, recommendation from the board, and authorization by council. So once that RFP is authorized by council, basically allows the city to go ahead and release it publicly. And so that is what is done. There's typically it's released in a local newspaper. I think it's also released on a platform called BidSync, which we'll talk a little bit about this morning. But really, once that is done, that's really kind of the end of the advertisement process. And so from there, we really move on into selection. And so the MAPS office and the city, they work to develop a selection committee. And so it typically involves members from various boards and people surrounding the projects. And so you can see the list here that we've included. So it typically includes someone from the MAPS office, subcommittee, Citizens Advisory Board, the city manager's office. And so there'll be a group of people that are assembled to basically oversee the selection process is really what it amounts to. And so that committee will have a lot of responsibilities. What will happen is at the end of the advertisement process, the city will receive all of these letters of interest, hopefully several, but it may be 4 or 5 letters of interest will be packages of information from potential operators. And so the selection committee will review those letters of interest. They'll develop recommendations regarding what we call a short list. And so let's say that there's 6 potential operators that respond. The committee may decide that there's 3 of those out of that 6 that deserve special consideration and interviews. And so the short list would include those 3. And then once those 3 are determined, that short list is developed, the selection committee would attend an interview. And then after the interviews, basically arrive at a recommendation on who should be engaged in terms of being the operator. And so they'll make that recommendation to the subcommittee and the advisory board. And so that recommendation will come forward and be considered. The advisory board will make a recommendation to council, and then council will confirm it or approve it. And so really once that's accomplished, it really authorizes staff to begin development of an operating agreement. And so usually so that's kind of moving into the next phase of activity. So it's really, I think if you were to look back at MAPS 3, those of you that were involved in MAPS 3, it's really basically kind of a 2-part process. And so usually what happens is we go through this process of developing a binding term sheet. And so that usually happens very early in the process. It typically happens like up towards the front of design. And then really, as you might expect, design and construction take several months. And so usually what happens is we go through design, we go through the majority of construction, and then as we near the end of completion of construction, there's actually a lease and management agreement that's executed by both parties. And so it's kind of a 2-step process, if you will. The binding term sheet really, in other jurisdictions, we do this sometimes as a memorandum of understanding, but really I guess the best way to characterize is it lays out the bones of the agreement between the city and the operator. And so it's usually a relatively brief document, and this is not a complete list of everything that's included, but really it's just, like I said, it's laying out the framework for what the formal agreement will be later. And so it's just basically a document that basically communicates to both parties exactly what the understanding is and allows them to move forward. So the binding term sheet that's done early, the final lease and management agreement that's done late, both of those items go through subcommittee, they go through the Citizens Advisory Board, and they're approved by council. And so there'll be 2 points along the way where we stop and bring those to you for your consideration. So that's really operations, selection, and agreement. Moving on into pre-design. So just to circle back here a little bit. Yes, sir, Mr. Black.
Would you just clarify? I'm having a little trouble wrapping my mind around the letter of interest. What was the something
RFQ.
OP? Yeah, that one.
The letter of interest in what? I didn't catch
The
that.
RFQ.
RFP. Okay, letter of interest, the RFP,
Okay.
and then much later on, when they actually are saying, here's what we will do, because it seems to me the advertisement goes out after the RFP.
No, so the advertisement concludes with the RFP being released.
Okay.
Once that goes out, advertising
Okay,
is done.
all right,
The letter of interest is the response to that RFP.
okay,
So if you're a potential operator, you respond to that RFP, that's your letter of interest. And then what was the third thing you were asking about the binding term sheet?
yes,
Yeah, so that's after an operator's been selected and the city's in the process of negotiating the agreement. Does that make sense?
Okay, sure. Well, it just seemed to me that the RFP, who's doing that? Potential operators?
No, the city will be releasing the RFP.
Okay, that's what I didn't get.
Yeah.
All right, thank you.
Request for proposals, so, yeah, I might have gone through that too quick. So if we get to the end of this and you still have questions, we'll try to clarify.
We're good.
it. Yes, ma'am.
Will we get a copy of this? I didn't see it in the packet.
A copy of the presentation? I'm sure we can make a copy available.
Okay, I'm
Yeah,
pretty sure.
it'll be available online, but if you want a hard copy, I can get that for you.
Oh, great. Okay, thank you.
Yeah, and really, the thing that we're trying to drive home here a little bit, with the last group of slides, we had these little blue arrows and indicated like these are places where you're going to see things coming forward for your consideration. And so that's, I think, really what we're trying to capture here a little bit this morning. So the pre-design phase of work, so just to circle back a little bit, so this is really kind of the group of activities that the city uses to engage a design firm. So hire an architect, hire an engineer. This is the process that we would go through to select that firm. And so it looks, in a lot of ways, it looks very similar to the operator selection process. There's still an advertisement process. There's still a selection process. It really concludes with what we kind of consider negotiation and award. And so that's really just city staff negotiating a contract with the selected design firm. So there are, as with the operator selection agreement, there are a few points along the way where we stop and check in with the subcommittee and the Citizens Advisory Board and Council. And so we've identified those here on this graph. And so, there'll be some involvement for one or more of you in the selection committee. Obviously, the selection committee recommendation would be something that would come to the board for your consideration. And then once a contract is negotiated, that contract would also come to the board for your recommendation to council for approval. So digging into each one of these in a little bit more detail, as I said, there is still an advertisement process. For A&E services, it looks a little bit different than the operator, primarily because there's a different department at the City of Oklahoma City that primarily administers it. It's administered through the Department of Public Works. And so they have this very prescribed way in which those services need to be procured, primarily because there's a, if you were to go on the Public Works website, you would find a copy of this 1986 resolution, which basically enumerates exactly how A&E selection needs to happen. And so the way that advertisements are developed is all prescribed in that resolution. So these are some of the things that you will see in that on these advertisements as they come out. They're typically a 1 to 2 page document that it will list the description of the project or the scope of the project, the estimated construction cost, anticipated schedule, when letters of interest need to be submitted by. And so it's just really a quick document. Again, it's released publicly to any A&E firms that may want to participate in the project. So there is, advertisements are published in the Journal Record. There's a way by which consultants can request to receive a letter in the mail whenever an advertisement goes out. And usually when the advertisements go out from the city, typically we provide them 3 to 6 weeks for any interested consultants to respond to that advertisement. And so, I mentioned 3 or 4 projects this morning already that we have RFQs out for. And so this is where they are at in the process. We have made this advertisement and we're in the process of receiving letters of interest right now. So. So once the advertisement goes out, we move on into the selection process. The selection process for A&E services is also prescribed. It's also administered by Public Works, and it's also prescribed by this 1986 resolution. And so there's a very methodical way that these services are procured. There's evaluation of these letters of interest. There's a development of a short list, much like the operating agreements that the potential operators that we talked about just a bit ago. And then there's also interviews. And so the 1986 resolution explains all of this. It talks about the interviews. One of the things that comes out of the interviews is just a recommendation from the selection committee regarding an order of negotiation. And so there's a state statute that requires that architecture and engineering services in particular have to be they have to be qualification-based, and so the city has to go through a process of making sure that the most qualified firm is selected for the work. So just a little bit of an aside, the letters of interest that the city receives on A&E services, just to give you, I guess, the sense of what would be included, they typically include just really a background of the firm. They typically include qualifications and experience of that firm, and so they'll assemble those as a part of their response. And then typically they would include a project approach, and so just really the team's attempt at explaining to the city how, in general terms, how they would approach the project. And so it is a lot of work, I would say, for projects which there's a lot of interest in the design community for. The city may receive 20 to 30 letters of interest sometimes. And so it's a lot of information to go through for those that are involved in that, and obviously a really important process too. So once the letter of interests are received and a short list is prepared, there are typically consultant interviews. Typically they last anywhere from 15 to 30 minutes. Larger projects sometimes require a little bit longer interviews. There's typically a Q&A session at the end of the interview, so the consultant teams will come in, they'll give a presentation to the city about the work, and then they'll give a chance for the selection committee to ask questions and get some answers from the team. So once that process is done, the selection committee will basically develop a recommendation. That recommendation will then come back through the subcommittee for consideration and confirmation. That subcommittee will make a recommendation to the board, and then the board, of course, will make a recommendation to council. And so that's really kind of the end of selection. So once the selection committee recommendation is confirmed by the board and recommended by council, and once council approves it or authorizes it, it basically releases city staff to really begin contract negotiation. And so the city has a standard A&E contract. It's very prescribed. You can see some of the things that are included in the contract. There's always an identification of the fixed limit of construction costs for the project. We typically divide services provided by the A&E team between basic services, those that we know are going to be a part of the project, and additional services, which are things which may come up during the course of the project, but if they do come up, usually the team receives additional compensation for those things. There's typically a schedule provided. We typically request that the teams provide a list of subconsultants or subcontractors that are involved, and so all of those things really will come forward with every single A&E contract involved in the program. So I can't ever remember a time of this happening, but there's actually a very prescribed method by which negotiations happen, and so the idea is that if Team A is selected, for whatever reason, the city and Team A cannot reach an agreement in terms of fee and scope, the city basically moves on to the next team, which is identified in the order of negotiation. And so, again, that's all prescribed really by Title 61, and the city follows that to the letter. Once contract negotiations finish and we've arrived at an agreement, that contract comes forward, it goes to the subcommittee and the Citizens Advisory Board, and then is approved by council. And then really once that's done, that's really the end of this pre-design phase. And so once it's approved by council, staff would issue a notice to proceed, and it would basically allow the consultant team to move forward with design work. So design is really, I think the best way to characterize it is really two distinct phases. And so the first phase is a preliminary report, and so that's a document that they'll prepare. We'll go into a little bit more detail, but they'll prepare a preliminary report for consideration, and then they do final plans. And so there's a couple of places along the way where the subcommittees and the Citizens Advisory Board and council will approve deliverables from the contract. And so the first of these would be at the end of the preliminary report phase. They would approve that preliminary report. And so you'll see those coming forward as we move into project execution. And then once we get done with final plans and we're ready to start bidding, those final plans will come forward for your approval as well. So some of the projects will have a relatively long design period, and so because of that, we will find projects where we have to have periodic reports from the consultant teams. And so it may be that they're not necessarily done with the preliminary report, but it may have been some time since we authorized them to begin work. And so David and his staff will periodically ask those teams to come forward with an update. So you might get an informational item on an agenda, which is just basically a presentation and a check-in point, just saying, hey, this is where we're at and this is what we're up to. I think sometimes David's staff will organize these around significant milestones in the design process. You know, it may be that we end programming or something, and so he feels like it's appropriate for them to come forward and kind of explain to the board where they're at. And so you'll see that happen from time to time, you know, not only during the preliminary report phase, but also during the final plan phase. So as I said, this preliminary report is really a key deliverable. You know, I think in essence what it captures is really the design intent of the project. And so a lot of the preliminary reports that we bring forward to the board, you know, they will have, you know, if it's a vertical building, they will have floor plans, show you what is anticipated to be inside the building, the scale of the building. And generally they'll include some description of materials. And so a lot of times you'll see renderings and things of the buildings and kind of as the architect or the design team has envisioned them. You know, obviously as we execute sidewalks, you're not going to get renderings of sidewalks. There'll be, those projects will be, the preliminary reports for those projects will be more technical in nature, but certainly the vertical projects that we're going to be executing, you'll see renderings as a part of the preliminary report. Some of the things that we get out of the preliminary report, I think as a group, as a team, that are really important is we always require a cost estimate. And so it's really important to the city that before we leave the preliminary report phase that the project's in budget. And so you'll get an opinion of cost at the end of preliminary report. It is preliminary though, and so what you'll find is that not all of the details of construction are there, and that's completely fine. It's what we expect, but we like to make sure that the team has it figured out enough that we understand the scope of the project, that we understand what the cost of the project is going to be. And so, as I said, for the larger projects, there'll be some periodic updates. I don't know that we need to go into a lot of detail there.
Jason, question.
Yes, ma'am.
My experience on the Park Subcommittee, and I'm trying to think about these projects, these tend to be more, mostly bricks and mortar, with the exception of some of the parks and beautifications and sidewalks. But we continued to have changes, and the plan of the park continued evolving even after construction had started. So can you talk to us a little bit about how those modifications and adjustments are dealt with even after construction has started?
Yeah, so when we get to that, I've got just a couple more slides, but we will address that because, yeah, that's something that you will.
You got it covered. All right, sorry.
No, that's okay. Yeah, so as I said previously, the preliminary report, once it is finalized, you know, it usually gets submitted in draft form to David in his office. We'll review it and approve it review it together, make sure it's ready for the board's consideration, and then it will come to you for your review and your consideration. Usually there's a presentation that's given by the team. So once the preliminary report gets through subcommittee and the board and is approved by council, it really authorizes David and his staff to issue a notice to proceed onto the final plans phase of work. And so once that's approved, they will do that. The team will move into what's called final plans. It's important to note that final plans refer collectively to really two things. It's not only the drawings for the project, but also what we call construction specifications. And so it's really just a big thick book that's got all the details that pretty much of everything that can't be communicated in the plans. And so there's a lot of information that's important in that set of construction specifications. You can see the list here. I don't know that I need to go through this exhaustively, but really just everything that a potential contractor would need to bid the project, and that's really what's included. So part of developing the final plans is getting all of this in order and ready for ready to release publicly on the street to potential construction companies. And so that's really the wraps up design. So construction, as we move into construction, really there's two phases of work. There's bidding and construction, and so there'll be 2 points in time where the board will weigh in. Once we open bids, there's a process that we go through during bidding. We'll release the final plans on the street. There'll be questions that come up during the bidding process. Contractors may have questions, and as a result of those questions, the design team may find that there's things they need to modify in the documents. So there'll be things issued like addenda during the bidding process. And so whenever we get through the bidding process and we open bids, the way that comes back to you is receipt of the bids, approval of the addenda that were issued during the bidding process, and award of the contract. And so that will go through subcommittee, the board, and then obviously authorized by council. And so that happens at the end of bidding. At the end of construction, there's a final acceptance process that we go through. And so that's really just the city saying, okay, contractor, you've completed your work, and now this is a city capital improvement that we now own. And so there's a formal process that we will go through. You'll see final acceptance items on the agenda from time to time as we finish projects up. There is a step in the process, typically during construction. You know, I would say on larger projects, it's almost a monthly process. We just finished a huge project, the convention center. We're finishing up the park. Change orders and amendments are a natural order of business, I guess is what I would say. It doesn't mean that there's anything wrong. It just means that there's things that we need to address and add. Really what it is it's the way that the city formally adds to the contract value for construction. And so you'll see these come up every month. There'll be a change order and amendment on a contract. And so it's just really just a natural order of business. And so but every time we adjust that contract, it has to be recommended from the board to council, and council has to authorize that change order or that amendment. And so you will see those come up from month to month to month. For the larger projects, we also will from time to time request that the design team come in and provide an update. And so, we might have a project that's 18 or 20 months in construction. That's a long time for the board and the subcommittee to be wondering what's going on. And so we'll ask the design team to come in, give us a construction update. Typically what happens is there's probably a change order or an amendment that needs to be approved. And so they'll sometimes walk the subcommittee or the board through what's included in that change order or that amendment that month, so everyone understands what's been added to the contract. So really, once the final plans are approved, we're basically authorized to begin bidding. And so all of the bidding process, it's all prescribed by state statute, Oklahoma statute, Title 61, public buildings and public works. And so there's this very prescribed way that the city has to go out and bid public construction contracts. It's really, there's actually a revision to Title 61 that's going on right now. So I think as of November 1, it's really anything in excess of about $50,000 has got to be bid through per the requirements of Title 61. There has to be notice given in a publication, a newspaper of general circulation, and we always have to provide at least 21 days between the date of first advertisement and the date that bids are open. And so that's a really important duration that we have to meet every time that we bid work. The city does utilize back in the olden days, I don't know if I should say olden days, but back in the olden days, this process looked much different than it does today. As you might imagine, design teams would prepare plans and specifications. There would be huge stacks of paper laying around the city, or I don't know if did they put them at the city clerk's office? I don't know where they picked them up, but yeah. So contractors would have to come and write a check and pick up their plans and specs, and then they would submit their bids in hard copy format, and so the generation that we're in now, that's all different. It's all done digitally, and so the city releases plans and specs digitally. Contractors can then download those documents. They review them digitally. They submit questions digitally. The consultant team or the city responds digitally. The bids are submitted digitally. They're open digitally, and so it's really, the process looks much different today than it did even 10 years ago. And so the platform that the city utilizes is BidSync. It's actually, you might hear it referred to as Periscope. They've gone through a little bit of a reorganization or rebranding. And so that is basically, anytime you hear anything about BidSync, that's the web platform that the city uses to procure construction contracts. And we'll also use it, I think, on operator advertisements too. So you'll hear it come up from time to time. So yeah, as I said, that platform allows us to basically distribute all of these things digitally, and so it really streamlines the process. The bids are still opened electronically in the city clerk's office, and so there's still some formality to that. A lot of times, I think contractors will submit bids, and, you know, they may go over to the city clerk's office and wait for them to be opened, so that they have to be publicly opened and read aloud. So that happens over in the clerk's office, I guess down one floor. And then really the bidding process, it concludes with the bids come to the subcommittee and the board and council. There's a ratification and approval of any addenda that were issued as a part of the bidding process. And then award of contract, obviously, to the lowest qualified bidder. Usually, in some projects, we may not know quite how the bids are going to come in. And so, you know, I'm trying to think of a good example, you know, on a, just let's take a youth center as an example. Let's say that we arrive at a 30,000 square foot design for a youth center. Well, let's say we're not quite sure how the bids may come in. So we may have a 5,000 foot expansion on that building that, depending if that the contractors will also bid on. And so we'll allow them to submit bids, and if the city can afford it, they may take what's called an alternate. And so as a part of receiving the bids, the city will basically confirm for the bidder, the lowest bidder, which alternates are going to be selected. We've had projects in the past that may have 9 or 10 alternates. And so it's really just our attempt at, one, making sure that we have at least a base bid that is under our budget amount, but two, trying to get an understanding of what adds to the scope of the contract might cost the city if they decide they want to do those. So when the bids come forward, the board and the council will approve any alternates. They'll select any alternates. And then really it just basically ends with approval of the contract and approval of any bonds that are submitted with the construction contract. And so that's really it. Construction starts. Once the bids are approved by council and contracts awarded, it authorizes staff to issue a notice to proceed. Yes, ma'am.
I have a question about the bidding. Is that documentation and those just provided in English? Is there any, does the city have like a multilingual or bilingual staff that, I don't know, I just feel like, I'm wondering if there's like any diversity, equity, and inclusion part into bidding, and kind of like what does that look like?
I feel like there might be someone in the room that can answer that question better than I can, either
Yeah,
David or
so
Laura.
my staff has people that are bilingual to start with. And then we are working on the program in conjunction with Public Works for disadvantaged businesses. So we are working on that. Right now, the documents are not in multiple languages, but we are sensitive to that and working towards that.
And then another question, are you guys partnered with any organizations, or is there a staff that helps these contractors or the ones who get these bids kind of go through the process of what it looks to receive a bid from the city?
So one thing that we failed to put in the presentation, Jason, is the pre-qualification piece of this. So all contractors that are able to bid on city projects have to be pre-qualified, and that goes through a process with Public Works. It makes sure that they're bondable, that they have insurance, checks their assets, all those kind of things. But again, that new program that we're putting together will address a lot of the things you're interested in.
Those are really good questions.
I just have a follow-up on that, but you don't have to be pre-qualified to apply as an operator, correct?
That's correct. It's contractors. Now, let me point out also that we do have the ability to bid contractors who aren't pre-qualified if we state it in the documents. We have done what we call a special questionnaire. So, for instance, on the Whitewater facility, we knew that there weren't a whole lot of contractors who had a whole lot of experience with whitewater facilities, but we did put a questionnaire in there about how much concrete work they'd done and who their subcontractors were and those kind of things, so we can still make sure that we get quality contractors.
Yeah, and the pre-qualification categories that David mentioned, those are things that are publicly available. So if you have any interest in that and the different pre-qualification categories or classifications, you can go and find that, or we could find it for you and send it over. So as I said previously, there will be updates to the subcommittee and the board and city council throughout the construction process. Probably less so to city council. I mean, sometimes there'll be, particular instances where we might want to give a construction update. But as you can imagine, when we get into deep into the throes of MAPS 4, there's going to be a lot of stuff in construction. There's obviously a lot of business that city council has to take care of in and of itself. And so the construction updates will primarily be at the subcommittee and the board level, but we will do them from time to time with council too. So there, as I said, there are change orders and amendments that happen throughout the construction process. So I think it's important to understand the difference between a change order and amendment. So a change order is where we add value to a contract, which cannot really be quantified from the bid itself. And so probably the best way to explain this, I'm just going to use a sidewalk project as an example. So let's say that we design and bid a sidewalk project, and it's got 100 square yards of concrete in it. Then let's say during the middle of that construction contract, we need to construct we find out that we need to construct some asphalt for some reason. Well, that bidder, that contractor has not provided a price to the city for construction of asphalt. And so in order to add asphalt into that contract, we would have to do a change order to change order that into the contract. So that's different from an amendment. So an amendment would be, we have a sidewalk project, we've bid 100 square yards of concrete sidewalk, and we find out that we need 105 square yards of sidewalk. And so that price is established in the contract already, and so we can simply amend the contract to add it by quantity. And so that's really, I think, the distinction between change orders and amendments is a good way to think about it. Title 61 requires that change orders can't exceed 10%, and so we're always monitoring that value, making sure that we stay below 10%. There's not a limit to amendments, and so you'll sometimes see significant amendments that come forward, but the value of those are somewhat less critical, I think, as we move through construction. And so construction really concludes with final acceptance, and so that's really just the city going through the process of accepting whatever improvements have been constructed. It really starts the warranty period, and so there'll be, it will vary by project, but there's some warranty period once the contractor gets done and says, I'm finished with my work. During that warranty period, on things like, it may be a 12-month period, it may be a 24-month period, but, once the operator takes possession of the building, and, it may be that, the carpet comes up off the floor and we need to have someone come out and fix it. And so things like that are done through a warranty process. And so the operator typically would reach out to the contractor, let them know that, hey, I've got a warranty item. They'd fill out a form, and sometimes the MAPS office needs to get involved to administer that. But
Yeah, so Jason, let's make sure it's not normal wear and tear items, and it's workmanship and materials. So if the carpet came up because the toilet flooded, it's not necessarily the contractor's issue unless the toilet flooded because of something he did.
yeah.
So it's not to take care of every little thing that happens. If a car runs into a building, it's not his fault.
Yeah, true. So that's really the end of construction. And so as I said, those 4 phases of work that we just went through, you're going to see those over and over and over and over again. So I think it's important that you have a feel for what you might expect to see as we're going through those. Really just to wrap up here, there is a lot of significant work in progress. As I said, we're working really diligently right now on the operator RFPs. We're also in the process of going through some additional departmental coordination with some of the other departments that are involved. As I've already said, we're really making a lot of administrative preparations, and so we're really kind of it kind of feels like the calm before the storm. It's about to really get busy, and so we are obviously getting prepared. There are a lot of things that are quickly approaching, so we have some letters of interest that are already coming in. The arena I've already mentioned, so my guess is one or more of you will probably be involved in the selection process on that. We'll be reviewing qualification statements. There'll be some short lists that will be developed, and then obviously some selection committee activities that will be going on in the next month. So that's really kind of what's going on, and obviously in November we're hoping to bring forward one or more operator RFPs for your consideration, and so I'm sure between now and then there'll be some other business that will also come up, and so I expect that we'll have a pretty full agenda next month. With that, I'm wrapped up, so if I have any questions I could answer, I know it's a lot of information, but it seems like it always is.
Jason, I just have one quick follow-up because of this example, because this does come up a lot whenever we are talking about change orders and amendments, warranty items. So, during the construction process, things happen, accidents happen, construction company hits a water line, or at that point, does that become who takes care of that? I've always been curious about this because it seems to pop up, or we weren't expecting a utility line there, and now we need to pay, $500,000 to have it moved.
Sure. So I'll take this, Jason. So I'll give you an example of the lower park right now. We can't see underground, so we didn't know about concrete foundations that were still out there. So that we did anticipate it. So we had an item in there on square yards of concrete foundation removal. So we are able to do amendments on that, and that is on the budget. That's on us. And then we found the batteries that I think everybody knows about down there. We did not anticipate that, but we had a city contract. It's more in depth than that, but the project ended up paying for that. Now, if a contractor damages something, let's say he tears up a street, or his building gets hit by a car again. I don't know why I'm focused on that. That's on his insurance, and that's on him. So it's kind of a case-by-case basis, but if it's something that they caused or something that they did, they have to pay for it. But if it's unknown circumstances, or trying to think of another situation of
Unforeseen conditions.
yeah, even sometimes on the design plans, we had a piece of ductwork on a wellness center that wasn't going to work in the right place, and we had to make a change on that. It was small, but we still did it.
Yeah.
And Jason talked about also change orders every month. It is our policy that we keep our bookkeeping, so to speak, make sure the contractor isn't strung out for several months and we lose track of what's happened with those change orders. So it's our policy every month we take care of that month's business. So if there's something hanging out there, we get that taken care of. Does that answer?
Yeah, and I think the other thing that's important to communicate is there is no perfect set of construction documents. I mean, we would all love to have it down to the letter and not have change orders and amendments, but it's just the nature of this type of work. So we try to obviously minimize that as much as possible, but yeah, things do come up. And I think, David's comment about we try to keep business current, I think for the construction industry that's involved in match programs, they very much appreciate that. I mean, that's dollars that they're out, and so keeping that business current is really important to them. And it seems inconsequential to the board, to approve $2,000 or $3,000 change orders, but it's just that philosophy of we take care of business every month. I think it really keeps things moving, and I think everyone appreciates that.
Any other questions? Yes. Shay?
This may be a more general question, but I was wondering if there were any updates on subcommittee assignments?
No.
Okay.
Sorry.
Thank you.
It's coming, I promise. Other questions? Jason, thank you for taking us through that. Like I said, I think that, especially given some of the questions that you've received, that was really helpful and helps us understand what to anticipate moving forward. Daisy?
Give a copy of the presentation?
Yes. Yeah. So maybe let's do it this way. If you want, so it's going to be online. It is online and part of the agenda, but if you want a paper copy, let David know. Okay? Okay, so on to item number 5. Any informational items for us today?
No, ma'am, nothing today.
Okay. Item 6, comments by board, staff, and citizens. Do we have any citizens signed up to speak today? No. Nope, okay. Board, any comments? I think Jason's advice and caution is we should take to heart. It's the calm before the storm, and although we were all, I think, very pleased and excited with the aggressive schedule, that also means that there's going to be a lot of activity simultaneous. So it's not going to be just sequential. I think it's going to be a lot all at the same time, so, which I think is exciting. I think that's going to be wonderful. Any staff comments?
No, ma'am.
Okay. All right. If we have no further business, we will adjourn and see you next month. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.